Michael Carter, the first black police chief in his town's history, thought he was returning to peace after a much-needed vacation. The sun was setting, and the winding country road felt familiar and safe. But that tranquility shattered in an instant when reckless driving turned into an encounter with his subordinates, two officers who saw him not as their chief, but as a target for their aggression. As the situation escalates from an initial confrontation to a brutal assault, Carter finds himself fighting not only for his dignity but for his very life. The painful betrayal he faces at the hands of those he trusted is only the beginning of a harrowing journey, leaving him battered, broken, and determined to seek justice. This story takes you from the heights of anticipation to the depths of despair, showcasing the resilience of a man who refuses to be defeated. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Michael Carter, the esteemed black police chief, was enjoying the drive home in his beloved car after a much-needed vacation. The familiar road stretched out endlessly before him, winding through the thick, lush forests that framed each side like nature's embrace. It was late afternoon, and the sun had begun its slow descent in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over everything it illuminated. Despite the fatigue settling into his bones from the long journey, Carter felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. There was something deeply comforting about returning to the town he had served for years, a place that held both his triumphs and struggles. As he drove along the serene countryside road, he took a moment to reflect on the responsibilities that awaited him back at the precinct. He had been away for weeks, recharging his mind and spirit, and now he felt invigorated and ready to tackle the challenges ahead. The police force depended on his steady hand, his unwavering sense of justice, and his unique experience as the first black chief of police in the town's history. Carter had navigated a minefield of challenges throughout his career. He had earned the respect of both the community and his team, but that respect came with its own set of burdens. He was constantly faced with the need to prove himself, battling against unspoken prejudices while carrying the weight of high expectations. With the tranquil scenery enveloping him, Carter's thoughts drifted to his plans for the upcoming weeks, the initiatives he wanted to implement, and the improvements he aimed to bring to the precinct. He was excited to roll up his sleeves and get back to work, to reconnect with his officers and engage with the community he loved. Suddenly, a buzz from his phone interrupted his thoughts. Glancing at the dashboard, he decided to ignore it for the moment, choosing instead to immerse himself in the peaceful drive. The road was quiet, almost eerily so, with only a few other vehicles scattered along the way. Taking a deep breath, he savored the calm that enveloped him, allowing the beauty of his surroundings to soothe his mind. However, this tranquility would soon be shattered. Out of nowhere, a car sped past him on the left, cutting dangerously close to his front bumper. Carter's hands tightened around the steering wheel instinctively, his foot slamming on the brakes as he swerved slightly to avoid a collision. His heart raced, pumping adrenaline through his veins, as he watched the other vehicle veer back into its lane, continuing as if nothing had occurred. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, frustration bubbling up inside him. The fleeting moment of peace had been obliterated. He watched as the reckless driver continued down the road, weaving in and out of lanes without a care for safety or the lives they endangered. Anger surged within him, replacing the calm that had once settled over him. This wasn't just reckless driving. It was a blatant disregard for the law, and he couldn't let it slide. Whoever was behind the wheel posed a danger not only to themselves, but to everyone else on the road. Carter's instincts kicked in. He was still in uniform, a reminder of his authority and duty, and he had planned to stop by the station upon returning to town. His badge rested on the passenger seat, a symbol of his commitment to uphold the law. Without a moment's hesitation, he pressed down on the accelerator, determination igniting within him as he set out to catch up with the reckless driver. As he closed the distance between them, Carter's anger boiled over. This kind of behavior was what he had fought against for years, a direct challenge to the very principles he stood for. He could see the driver swerving erratically, endangering not just themselves, but potentially causing harm to innocent lives. Deciding he could not let this situation escalate any further, Carter activated his lights, flashing them as a clear signal for the driver to pull over. He watched intently as the speeding car slowed slightly, but instead of complying, it jerked violently to the side of the road, skidding to a halt in the gravel. Without missing a beat, Carter followed suit, his vehicle screeching to a stop behind them. What happened next would shock him to his core, challenging everything he believed about loyalty, trust, and the very fabric of the police force he had dedicated his life to serving. As he stepped out of his car, a deep-seated unease settled over him, warning him that this encounter would not just be a routine traffic stop, but a fight for survival against those he had once considered his allies. Do not miss this thrilling story as it unfolds, and be sure to watch until the end. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video. He stepped out of his vehicle, the sound of his boots crunching against the loose gravel beneath him resonating in the stillness of the afternoon. As he made his way toward the other car, his heart raced with the adrenaline still coursing through his veins from the near miss. A storm of anger simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to erupt as he approached the vehicle. As he drew nearer, the doors swung open with a creak, and two men stepped out, both clad in the unmistakable uniform of law enforcement. Carter's eyes widened in shock. These were police officers. However, the momentary surprise quickly faded into a deep sense of unease. "What's your problem?" one of the officers barked, stepping forward with an air of aggression that made Carter instinctively tense. The second officer followed closely behind, a menacing scowl etched across his face that radiated hostility. Despite the tension escalating around him, Carter maintained his composure, even as every instinct screamed at him that this confrontation was about to take a dangerous turn. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. "I could ask you the same question," he replied firmly, forcing his voice to remain steady, even as his heart raced. "You nearly caused an accident back there." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting momentarily before they erupted into laughter. A harsh, mocking sound that cut through the air. "And who the hell do you think you are?" the first officer spat, stepping closer, invading Carter's personal space. Carter surveyed them both, noting their arrogant expressions and the way they towered over him. He realized they had no idea who they were dealing with. They hadn't recognized him. "I'm Michael Carter," he declared, his tone unwavering yet calm. "Chief of police." For a fleeting moment, silence enveloped them. The officers stared at him, and it felt as though they might finally grasp the gravity of their mistake. But then, the first officer sneered dismissively. "Chief of police? Right," he scoffed, sarcasm dripping from his words. "Sure you are, and I'm the mayor." Carter's expression hardened, narrowing his eyes in frustration. This wasn't the first time he had faced such blatant disrespect, but the atmosphere had shifted, quickly escalating toward danger. These officers were not merely dismissive. Their hostility was palpable. "I suggest you calm down," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "You're making a big mistake." But they ignored him completely. The second officer stepped forward, placing a hand on his belt, a clear indication of his aggressive intent. "We don't take kindly to people like you trying to act like they're in charge," he spat venomously. Carter could feel his patience thinning, a knot of anger forming in his stomach. "People like me?" he asked, arching an eyebrow, already knowing the unspoken meaning behind their words. The first officer's smirk deepened, filled with contempt. "Yeah, people like you." Before Carter could respond, the first officer lunged at him, shoving him forcefully in the chest. Caught off guard by the sudden aggression, Carter staggered back, struggling to regain his balance. The second officer quickly joined in, pushing him again, this time with even greater force, causing him to tumble backward onto the gravel. Carter's mind raced in disbelief. He could hardly fathom what was happening. These men, his officers, the very ones he was responsible for, were attacking him without a shred of recognition. Even worse, they didn't care. In their eyes, he was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. As he fought to regain his footing, one of the officers delivered a vicious kick to his ribs, sending a wave of pain shooting through his side. "You're going to regret messing with us," the officer snarled, venom lacing his words. Carter struggled to catch his breath. The the pain intensifying as he rolled onto his side, clutching his ribs, humiliation flooding over him. This wasn't merely a physical assault. It was a profound degradation. "Stop," he gasped, raising his hand in a feeble attempt to defend himself. "I'm your boss. I'm the chief." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The beating continued mercilessly, each blow landing with increasing force and pain. As Carter lay there, battered and bruised, a chilling realization settled over him. This was only the beginning of his nightmare. Michael Carter lay on the gravel, fighting to breathe as the pain surged through his body like a relentless tide. Each inhale felt like a battle, sharp, agonizing stabs coursing through his chest where the officers had kicked him. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion. How had this situation escalated so quickly? How had two of his officers launched such a brutal attack without a second thought? But there was no time to dwell on the shock. His survival instincts kicked in, forcing him to focus on the immediate need to escape this nightmare. Carter groaned as he tried to push himself off the ground, every movement sending waves of agony through his ribs. The pain was excruciating, each breath sharp and shallow. Before he could fully process the severity of his injuries, one of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a cold, menacing glare, grabbed Carter by the collar of his shirt and jerked him up without a hint of mercy. His grip was ironclad, suffocating, and he spat out a command as if Carter were nothing more than a nuisance. "Get up!" the officer snarled, his voice dripping with anger and disdain. His face twisted into an ugly sneer, his eyes narrowing as though he relished the suffering. Carter's legs trembled beneath him as he tried to comply, but as he pushed himself up, the sharp, shooting pain in his side intensified. He opened his mouth to speak, to plead for a moment of reprieve, but the words caught in his throat. He could barely muster enough air to form a sentence, and before he could find his balance, the second officer, shorter but no less brutal, moved in with terrifying speed. His fist collided with Carter's stomach in a vicious, bone-crushing punch. Carter doubled over instantly, his body folding under the force of the blow. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as the pain spread like wildfire through his torso. His breath came in shallow, desperate bursts, and he could barely see through the haze of agony clouding his mind. His ribs felt as though they were being crushed under the weight of each breath, and he struggled to stay conscious, blinking furiously to keep the world from spinning out of control. "I told you, I'm the chief of police," Carter rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, each word a struggle against the suffocating pain. He needed them to understand the magnitude of their mistake, to realize the consequences of their actions, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The first officer barked out a cruel, mocking laugh, the sound echoing off the empty, desolate road as if the night itself shared in his amusement. "Chief of police?" The officer's voice was filled with scorn, his grin widening as if he found the very notion absurd. He shoved Carter backward with a force that sent him stumbling, his back slamming into the hard metal of his car. Carter's head spun, and he fought to keep his footing, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The second officer circled him like a predator toying with its prey, his hand resting menacingly on the baton strapped to his belt. His smirk was a reflection of pure malice. "You're nothing but a punk who thinks he can play the hero," the second officer jeered, his voice low and taunting. He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with the sadistic pleasure of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. "And now you're going to pay for trying to mess with us." Carter's heart raced, pounding in his chest with the force of impending doom. His mind was clouded by pain, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had to get out of this alive. The officers were out of control, their rage and arrogance feeding off one another. Carter could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, urging him to fight back, but logic held him still. He knew better than to escalate the situation. These men weren't just angry, they were dangerous. "Look, you're making a mistake," Carter managed to choke out, his voice hoarse, every word a strain. His ribs throbbed with each breath, but he had to keep trying. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The taller officer rolled his eyes, his expression darkening with contempt as he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with," he hissed, his face inches from Carter's. His breath was hot and foul, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "Just another nobody who thinks he can tell us what to do. You're lucky we haven't hauled your ass in yet." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The threat hung heavy in the air, every word laced with malice. Carter knew these weren't idle threats. They were promises of further violence. He could see it in their eyes, in the way they carried themselves. These men were drunk on their power, and nothing he said would change that. Before Carter could respond, the second officer grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with brutal force. There was a sickening crack, and Carter screamed. A raw, primal sound torn from deep within as the pain exploded up his arm. The officer didn't release his grip. Instead, he twisted harder, pushing the joint beyond its limit until Carter was certain his arm would snap in two. "Still think you're the chief of police?" the officer sneered, his voice filled with mocking cruelty. The words were meant to humiliate, to break what little resolve Carter had left. Carter gritted his teeth, trying desperately to hold back another scream as the agony shot through his body. "I am the chief," he forced out, his voice barely a whisper, but it was futile. The officers didn't care. They were past the point of reason, consumed by their need to assert dominance. With one final, savage twist, Carter felt the bone in his arm break. The blinding, all-encompassing pain stole the air from his lungs, and for a moment, his vision went white. The world around him faded into a blur of sound and sensation as he crumpled to his knees, his arm hanging uselessly at his side. The taller officer looked down at him with a satisfied smirk. "Guess you won't be needing that arm anymore," he said coldly. "Let that be a lesson for getting in our way." But they weren't done. Not yet. The second officer strolled over to Carter's car, eyeing it with disdain as he ran his hand over the hood. "Nice car," he remarked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He glanced back at Carter, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Shame if something happened to it. Carter's stomach twisted with dread. He knew what was coming next, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His car, the one he had worked so hard to buy, the one he had taken such pride in, was about to become another casualty of their cruelty. "Don't," Carter gasped, but his voice was weak, and the plea fell on deaf ears. The officer had already pulled a lighter from his pocket, flicking it open with a flick of his thumb. The flame flickered, casting a sinister glow in the darkness. "You know, we don't usually burn cars," the officer said, his voice casual, almost conversational. "But for you, I'll make an exception." He tossed the lighter onto the car's fuel tank without a second thought. The flames erupted almost instantly, roaring to life as they engulfed the vehicle. The fire spread rapidly, licking up the sides of the car and filling the air with thick, acrid smoke. Carter could only watch in helpless horror as the inferno consumed his beloved car, the heat from the flames scorching his skin even from a distance. His heart sank deeper into despair as he realized just how powerless he truly was. Michael Carter's heart pounded in his chest, a dull roar in his ears as the gravity of his situation crashed over him like a wave. Alone, injured, and stranded without his car, he stood helpless, watching his life go up in flames. The officers hung back, smirking, their eyes gleaming with satisfaction as the fire consumed the car. It wasn't just a vehicle, no, it was far more than that. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for, the representation of his success and sacrifice. Now, all of it was turning to ash right before his eyes, destroyed by the very people who were supposed to serve under him. "Looks like your ride's done for," one of the officers taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. The words cut deep, but Carter couldn't tear his gaze away from the blaze. His hands clenched into fists, the pain from his broken arm nearly unbearable, but the emotional agony eclipsed everything. They weren't just burning his car, they were burning everything he stood for. But they weren't done with him yet. The first officer strolled over with a cruel smirk, yanking Carter up by his shirt collar and forcing him to his feet with brutal force. "You thought you could stop us, huh?" he growled, his breath hot against Carter's face. "Think again." With a powerful shove, he sent Carter crashing back to the ground. His head slammed against the gravel, the impact rattling his skull and sending him spiraling into darkness. For a moment, everything went black, the world spinning out of control. When his vision cleared, he could see the second officer rifling through his pockets, his fingers moving with swift precision. "Thanks for the cash," the officer sneered, waving Carter's money in front of his face with sickening glee. "Consider this your toll for getting in our way." Carter's stomach churned with disgust, but he was too weak to fight back. His head throbbed violently, and his body felt like it was on the verge of giving out. His broken arm dangled uselessly at his side, a sharp reminder of just how powerless he was. The pain in his ribs stabbed with each breath, and the weight of his injuries pressed down on him like a boulder. They had taken everything from him: his car, his money, his phone, and now, his dignity. The officers laughed as they walked away, their footsteps crunching over the gravel as they returned to their squad car. One of them glanced back, a sneer plastered on his face. "Next time, don't try to be a hero," he called out as they climbed into the vehicle. The engine roared to life, and within moments, they were gone, leaving Carter alone on the side of the road, surrounded by darkness and the remnants of his burning car. The sound of the car's engine faded into the distance, replaced by the eerie stillness of the forest. The heat from the fire still radiated against Carter's skin, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air, clinging to his clothes and hair. His body was a mass of pain, each breath sending shockwaves through his battered ribs. The gravel beneath him was cold and unforgiving, and as much as he wanted to move, his body wouldn't obey. For a moment, Carter lay still, the overwhelming ache in his body threatening to drown him. He was miles from town, his phone gone, his car destroyed, and no one to call for help. But amidst the pain, something stronger began to burn inside him, something that couldn't be extinguished by the officer's brutality. It was his determination, a fierce resolve that flared brighter than the flames. He was going to make it back. He was going to make them pay for what they had done. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Carter forced himself up, his body trembling with the effort. His vision blurred from the strain, and for a second, he thought he might collapse. But he didn't. He pushed through the pain, standing unsteadily on his feet. His broken arm hung at his side, a dead weight pulling him down, but he ignored it. His journey had only just begun. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Each step was agony, but Carter moved forward, his jaw clenched against the waves of pain. The road stretched out in front of him, winding through the dark forest with no end in sight. The town was still miles away, and it would take hours to reach it on foot. He stumbled several times, the pain making it harder and harder to keep going, but he couldn't stop now, not when everything was at stake. As he trudged forward, his mind replayed the events of the night. How could this be real? How could 2 of his officers, men who had sworn an oath to serve and protect, betray him like this? But Carter knew the truth. They hadn't seen him as their superior. They hadn't even seen him as a person. To them, he was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. His rank, his authority, it meant nothing to them. All they had seen was his skin color, and that was all the justification they needed to strip him of his dignity. Anger surged through Carter, mixing with the pain, giving him the strength to keep moving. His whole life had been a fight against prejudice, against the ignorance of others who judged him before they knew him. But this was different. This was personal. Those officers had taken pleasure in his suffering and had gone out of their way to humiliate him, to make him feel powerless. But they had underestimated him. They thought they had won. But Carter wasn't finished. He would survive this, and he would make sure they were held accountable. His determination was the only thing keeping him upright now, fueling his every step as he trudged down the dark, desolate road. The night stretched on, cold and unforgiving, but Carter pressed on, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the town in the distance. He would get there, and when he did, he would make sure those officers learned that they had messed with the wrong man. Carter stumbled again, his legs buckling beneath him as fatigue racked his body. His muscles screamed for a reprieve, but there was no mercy in the jagged gravel road beneath his feet. With a sickening thud, he hit the ground hard, his body jarring violently as pain exploded across every nerve. His knees scraped against the unforgiving stones, shredding the skin on his palms as he instinctively braced himself. The sharp agony from his broken arm tore through him, and for a brief, excruciating moment, he thought he might pass out from the sheer intensity of it. He lay there, face down in the dirt, gasping for breath, his chest rising and falling in desperate, shallow bursts. His vision blurred and swam, the world around him flickering between the harsh reality of his pain and the dizzying haze of exhaustion. His mind screamed at him to get up, to keep going, but his body felt disconnected, heavy, and unresponsive. He had nothing left, no strength, no energy, no will, but he couldn't stay down. Not here, not now. The ground beneath him was as cold and unforgiving as the night air around him, offering no comfort, only a stark reminder of how far he still had to go. The relentless chill seeped into his bones, amplifying the sense of isolation and despair. The officers had left him to die out here, discarded him like trash, assuming he wouldn't survive the night. They didn't know Michael Carter. They didn't know the fight that still burned in him. With a groan, Carter pushed himself up, his muscles trembling with the effort. His vision blurred again as he managed to rise to his knees. The sharp, searing pain in his ribs made him wince, but he gritted his teeth and forced his body to cooperate. Slowly, agonizingly, he shifted his weight and rose to his feet, swaying unsteadily as his legs threatened to buckle beneath him once more. The world tilted dangerously, but he locked his knees and forced himself to stay upright. "I have to keep moving," he muttered, his voice a raspy whisper barely audible in the stillness of the night. His lips were dry and cracked, his throat parched, but the words grounded him. "I have to." He glanced up at the sky, now a blanket of pitch black, stars obscured by the thick clouds overhead. He had no idea how long it had been since the attack. Time had lost all meaning. The only thing that mattered was the distant glow of the town, the faint flicker of lights in the far-off distance. It seemed impossibly far, like a mirage just beyond his reach, but it was his only hope. His head throbbed with every step, a dull, rhythmic pounding that grew worse as he trudged forward. He could feel the sticky warmth of blood trickling down the side of his face, matting his hair, but he didn't care. The burning ache in his ribs made each breath a laborious task, shallow and painful, and his arm. God, the pain in his arm was unbearable, as though the bone had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. Yet beneath the overwhelming pain, a deeper force drove him forward, rage. His anger was a living thing, fueling his every movement. It wasn't just physical survival at this point. It was justice. Those officers thought they could do this to him, thought they could leave him for dead and get away with it. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Michael Carter wasn't just a man. He was their commanding officer, and he wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. The road stretched endlessly before him, and hours seemed to blur into one another as he limped forward, his steps uneven and halting. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes, each footfall a reminder of how far he still had to go. He tried to block out the memory of the burning car and the cruel laughter of the officers as they left him to his fate. He couldn't afford to dwell on that now. He had to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, on making it back to town, back to where he could take control again. At times, his body threatened to give out entirely, his legs trembling violently under the strain. His vision would darken, the world spinning around him as nausea clawed at his gut. But he pressed on, fueled by sheer willpower and the white-hot fury bubbling inside him. Slowly, agonizingly, the lights of the town crept closer, though it felt like he was walking through quicksand, each step a monumental effort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the town's outskirts came into view. The faint glow of streetlights cut through the oppressive darkness, guiding him like a beacon. Relief surged through him, but it was fleeting. He wasn't safe yet. His work wasn't done. He hadn't reached the precinct, the place where justice would begin. Carter's legs shook with exhaustion as he crossed into the town, the familiar shapes of buildings and homes gradually coming into focus. But everything felt surreal, distant, as though he were moving through a dream. His body was on the verge of collapse, and his mind was clouded with fatigue, but he couldn't stop now. Not until he made it to the police station. The station was only a few blocks away, but each step toward it felt like torture. His entire body screamed for rest, for an end to the agony, but his mind refused to give in. His focus narrowed to a singular thought: justice. He needed to confront them. He needed them to see him standing there, alive. He needed to make them understand that they had failed. At long last, the police station came into view. The brick building stood tall under the streetlights, its presence a stark reminder of the authority and power it represented. Carter's heart raced as he stumbled toward it, his body on the verge of collapsing beneath him. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, his fingers slick with blood and dirt. With a surge of adrenaline, he shoved the door open, staggering inside. The bright lights of the lobby blinded him momentarily, but he forced himself forward, his feet dragging across the floor. The officers behind the front desk looked up in shock as Carter approached, their eyes widening at the sight before them. He was a mess, covered in blood, dirt, and grime, his clothes torn, his arm hanging uselessly at his side. But he was alive, and he wasn't done yet. "Chief," one of the officers shot to his feet, his voice filled with shock and disbelief as he watched Carter limp into the station, bruised and bloodied. The room, previously filled with the usual banter and chatter, fell into a stunned silence. Every pair of eyes locked onto their battered leader, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. Carter, however, paid no attention to the stares. His mind was already 3 steps ahead, focused only on what needed to be done next. Without breaking stride, Carter pushed through the crowd of stunned officers, his body screaming in protest with every movement. The hallway to his office felt longer than ever, but his determination was unshakable. "I need every available officer," he rasped, his voice hoarse but laced with steely resolve. There was no time to explain what had happened. There was only time for action. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Behind him, the station erupted into movement. Officers scrambled to follow his orders, still processing the fact that their chief, someone they'd always seen as unbreakable, had been attacked. But Carter couldn't slow down. He refused to let his injuries dictate his next move, though his legs felt like they could give out at any moment. His heart pounded, his breath came in short bursts, and every fiber of his body begged for rest. But rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. Reaching his office, Carter nearly collapsed into the chair behind his desk, his hands gripping the armrests as if to anchor himself to consciousness. Pain coursed through his veins, radiating from the bruises and broken bones that covered his body. His vision blurred as exhaustion threatened to overtake him, but the sheer force of will kept him upright. He couldn't give in. Not yet. Not until those responsible were caught. The door to his office burst open, and several of his senior officers rushed in, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion. "Chief, what the hell happened?" One of them blurted out, panic creeping into his voice. Carter, swallowing the agony that threatened to betray him, steadied himself and fixed them with a hard stare. "I was attacked," he said coldly, his voice void of emotion, "by 2 of our own." The room froze. The weight of his words settled over them like a dark cloud. "They thought they could get away with it," Carter continued, his tone icier than before. "I want every available unit out there, now. Find them. Bring them in." The stunned silence was soon replaced by the hurried shuffle of feet as his officers sprang into action, rushing out of the office to mobilize. Carter watched them go, his vision swimming from the pain that pulsed through his body, but he didn't care. His adrenaline kept him anchored, kept him going. His men would find those traitors, and when they did, there would be no mercy. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall became a metronome to his thoughts. As Michael Carter sat hunched at his desk, barely able to keep his eyes open, Every breath sent stabbing pain through his ribs, and his broken arm throbbed in relentless torment. His body was a battlefield, cut, bruised, and broken, but his mind refused to rest. He kept replaying the attack over and over in his head, the sneering faces of the officers who had betrayed him etched into his memory. They had left him for dead, discarded like trash on the side of the road. But they had underestimated him. Outside his office, the station buzzed with frenetic energy. Radios crackled with orders, boots pounded the floor, and officers were gearing up for the manhunt. The air was charged with purpose as they prepared to hunt down the very men who had once been their brothers in arms. Carter's senior officers had spared no effort, deploying every available unit to comb the town and surrounding areas. The men who had turned on him were now being hunted by the very force they had betrayed, and Carter took grim satisfaction in knowing they would not escape. Leaning back in his chair, Carter winced as a fresh wave of pain surged through his ribs. His thoughts churned with a mix of anger and determination. Those officers, those cowards, had looked him in the eye with cruelty and arrogance, convinced they could brutalize him and walk away without consequence. They had been wrong. They would pay for their betrayal. Carter's blood boiled with the thought of it. Justice was coming for them, and it would be swift and unforgiving. The door creaked open, and Lieutenant Andrews, one of Carter's most trusted officers, stepped inside. His face was taut with worry, his eyes scanning over Carter's injuries before meeting his gaze. "Chief, we're ready," Andrews said, his voice calm but threaded with concern. "Patrols have been dispatched to all major roads and checkpoints. We've got officers sweeping the town. We'll find them." Carter gave a slow, measured nod, gritting his teeth as he adjusted in his seat. "Good," he said, his voice a low growl. "They think they can get away with this? They're dead wrong. I want them found, and I want them brought here." His tone left no room for misinterpretation. There would be no leniency, no second chances. Those men would face the full wrath of the law, and of Carter himself. Andrews paused longer than usual, his brow furrowing with visible concern as he took in the severity of Carter's condition. The chief's pale complexion and labored breathing were signs that he needed urgent medical attention, but Carter's steely expression left no room for sympathy. "Sir, are you sure you don't want to go to the hospital? You're in bad shape. You need medical help," Andrews urged, his voice heavy with worry. Carter responded with a dismissive wave, his jaw tightening as he squared his shoulders against the pain. "I'll handle that later. Right now, those two are all that matters." His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of determination. Understanding that Carter's mind was made up, Andrews simply nodded, sensing the resolve behind his words. There was no use in pushing the issue any further. Carter wasn't a man to back down, not in a situation like this. "We'll get them, Chief," Andrews assured him, before giving a respectful nod and exiting the office. As the door clicked shut, Carter exhaled deeply, forcing himself to ignore the sharp pangs that coursed through his body. His muscles screamed for rest, his wounds aching, but he pushed it all aside. His mind was still sharp, laser-focused on the task ahead. He couldn't afford to falter now, not when they were so close. He glanced at the clock, watching the seconds tick by slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. Time dragged on painfully, the tension in the air thick and oppressive. The station's radio crackled with updates, officers in the field combing every corner of the town, searching side streets, alleys, and desolate parking lots. But there was still no sign of the two men. Carter leaned back in his chair, briefly closing his eyes in an attempt to block out the pain, refocusing his thoughts. These two men weren't amateurs. They'd be trying to slip out of town quietly, evading the dragnet that had been set. But Carter had planned for this. He had tightened the net, so there was no escape. The perimeter was locked down, and it was only a matter of time before they were flushed out. His eyes snapped open when the office door swung open again. This time, it was Officer Johnson, young, but one of the most reliable officers on Carter's team. His expression was grim, and his radio buzzed with chatter, indicating the tension in the field. "Chief," Johnson said, stepping forward, urgency in his voice. "We just got a solid tip. Someone spotted two officers fitting their description heading towards the old service road, just outside town limits. Carter's heart rate quickened. The old service road. It was a perfect route for a quiet escape. Isolated, surrounded by dense forest, it paralleled the highway without being visible from it. It was smart, but also exactly where they would be vulnerable. Send all available units there now, Carter ordered, rising from his chair despite the fiery pain in his side. His legs wobbled, but he forced himself to stand straight, gritting his teeth. Johnson stepped forward, ready to assist, but Carter shook him off, determined to stand on his own. "I want them surrounded before they even think about reaching the highway," he said, his voice firm. Johnson quickly relayed the orders into his radio, his tone clipped and urgent. "All units, this is Officer Johnson. Be advised, suspects have been sighted near the old service road by Route 25. Approach with caution. Suspects are armed and dangerous." Carter grabbed his jacket, slipping it on with his good hand, and despite his condition, his eyes burned with resolve. He wasn't going to sit idly by in the station while his officers went after the men responsible for this. He needed to be there, on the front line, when it all came to a head. "Chief, you're in no shape to go out there," Johnson said, concern coloring his words, but Carter's expression remained implacable. He locked eyes with Johnson, his voice low but forceful. "I'm going." End of discussion. Johnson hesitated, knowing better than to argue with him, before giving a resigned nod. "I'll drive." Together, they moved through the station, Carter's steps deliberate but slow, each one a struggle. The pain throbbed with every movement, but his determination overpowered it. As they passed by, officers paused in their work, turning to watch. Their faces were etched with a mixture of shock, admiration, and anger. Seeing their chief, battered, bruised, but refusing to back down, ignited a fire in them all. Everyone knew what those rogue officers had done to Carter, and now, the entire department was united in their mission to bring them to justice. As Carter stepped out into the cool night air, his eyes focused on the horizon. He knew this was far from over, but the end was in sight. The hunt was on, and Carter was going to see it through, no matter the cost. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Johnson led Carter to the patrol car, supporting him as he gingerly settled into the passenger seat. Once Carter was secured, Johnson quickly moved to the driver's side, sliding behind the wheel. With a sharp turn of the key, the engine roared to life, and in an instant, they were speeding through the quiet streets, the lights of the small town quickly fading behind them as they headed toward the desolate outskirts. Every minute felt stretched and tense. The air inside the car was thick with unspoken thoughts, and the radio crackled intermittently, punctuating the silence with updates from other officers. Patrol cars were converging on the service road, their voices clipped as they reported their positions. The calm before the storm. Carter stared straight ahead, the dark road unfolding like an ominous path towards something inevitable. His thoughts raced, crashing against each other in a whirlwind of rage, humiliation, and a thirst for justice. How would he handle it when they finally caught up to those rogue officers? He didn't know for sure, but one thing was certain: they would pay. His chest tightened with every second that brought them closer to their quarry. As they neared the service road, the tension in the car escalated, a silent countdown in Carter's mind. Johnson eased off the gas, slowing as they approached the turnoff. The narrow, barely discernible path was swallowed by towering trees, their twisted branches forming a dark canopy overhead. The patrol car's headlights barely pierced the dense shadows, casting fleeting images of the forest in ghostly light. "Looks like we've got company," Johnson muttered, nodding toward the cluster of flashing lights ahead. Several patrol cars were already parked haphazardly along the side of the road, their beams cutting through the underbrush. Officers were moving cautiously, their bodies silhouetted against the trees as they advanced toward the dense woods where the suspects had been spotted. Carter's heart hammered in his chest. His hand, still aching from his injuries, fumbled with the door handle before he swung it open. The sharp pain that shot through his arm as he stepped out of the car was nothing compared to the fire burning inside him. Every bruise, every broken bone screamed for retribution, but Carter's focus was unshakable. He had to be there when those men were brought down. As he stood beside the car, Lieutenant Andrews approached, his face a mixture of relief and determination. "Chief, we've got them pinned down," Andrews reported, his voice low and urgent. "About half a mile in. They tried to make a break for it, but we've got the area surrounded. There's nowhere for them to go." Carter nodded, his jaw clenched tight, the muscles in his neck straining. "Good. I want to be there when they're taken in." Andrews hesitated, his gaze drifting to the darkening bruises on Carter's face and the way he held his arm protectively against his side. "Sir, I think I'm going," Carter snapped, his voice cold and final. "I need to see this through." There was no room for debate. Without another word, he followed Andrews toward the line of officers preparing to move into the woods. The forest swallowed them quickly, the sounds of the city fading into nothing. The only noise was the crunch of leaves and the occasional crack of a twig beneath their boots. The darkness seemed alive, every rustle of the wind through the branches feeling like a warning, a prelude to something violent. Carter's senses were on high alert as they moved deeper into the trees, the light from the patrol cars now distant and faint. Every step seemed to carry him closer to the reckoning he craved. At last, they reached a small clearing, and there, huddled together under the shadow of the trees, were the two officers. The men who had beaten him senseless and left him for dead. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with the cold realization that their time had run out. Several officers stood around them, guns drawn, ready for any sudden move. But there was no resistance left in them. Their bravado had drained away, replaced with fear. They knew they were caught. Carter pushed through the circle of officers, his gaze fixed on the two men, his mind flashing back to the searing pain, the humiliation, the helplessness. His voice was low but seething with barely controlled fury as he spoke. "You thought you could get away with this?" he said, stepping closer. The officer's eyes darted to the ground, too ashamed to meet his gaze. "You thought you could leave me there, broken and bleeding, and no one would know. But you were wrong." The men said nothing. Their arrogance had crumbled, leaving nothing but the cold dread of what was to come. Carter could feel their fear, and for the first time that night, he felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. The tables had turned. "Take them in," he ordered, his voice hard and unyielding. The officers moved swiftly, cuffing the two men and leading them toward the patrol cars. Carter watched as they were hauled away, their faces now drained of all color, every trace of defiance gone. But even as they disappeared into the night, the heavy weight on Carter's chest didn't lift. Justice would be served, yes, but something inside him still burned. Back at the police station, the adrenaline that had been keeping Carter upright was starting to wear off. He sat behind his desk, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead casting long shadows across the room. The weight of the night's events bore down on him, each breath sending sharp stabs of pain through his ribs. His arm throbbed relentlessly, the broken bones screaming for attention. Yet, none of that compared to the simmering anger that still coursed through him. The two men who had turned against their chief, their duty, were now sitting in holding cells, realizing the full scope of their betrayal. They hadn't just attacked any man. They had assaulted the very person they had sworn to follow and protect. And now, the consequences of that betrayal were coming down on them like an avalanche. Carter could picture them in those cells, the shock still settling in, as the enormity of what they had done became clear. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Carter wasn't just seeking justice anymore. He wanted to see their careers, their lives, torn apart, piece by piece. They would understand the depth of their mistake before this was all through. Carter's men had executed his orders swiftly and without hesitation. The two rogue officers had been apprehended, booked, and stripped of their badges in record time. Now, they sat in the holding cells, waiting for the consequences of their actions to come crashing down. Neither had uttered a word since their arrest, perhaps too shocked to comprehend the gravity of what they had done. Or maybe they were just beginning to grasp the depth of the hole they had dug themselves into. Carter, however, had no interest in their fear, their regret, or their excuses. Not now, not after the betrayal they'd inflicted on him. Slowly, Carter pushed himself up from his desk, gritting his teeth as a sharp pain lanced through his ribs. His injuries screamed for rest, a constant reminder of the brutality he'd endured, but he refused to stop. Not yet. Not until this ordeal was truly over. There was still one final piece to handle. He began his slow march through the station, his footsteps echoing loudly in the dimly lit hallway. The weight of each step felt in his battered body. Every officer he passed gave him a solemn nod of respect, their faces taut with concern and admiration. They had seen him when he returned to the station, bruised, bloodied, but unwavering. Despite the beating he'd endured, he had returned not as a victim, but as a man determined to see justice served. And now, as he walked with purpose, they understood this wasn't just about enforcing the law anymore. This was deeply personal. He arrived at the holding cells, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the two men inside. The once cocky, aggressive officers who had mercilessly attacked him were now nothing more than broken shells of their former selves. Their arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind only fear and shame. Carter felt no satisfaction at seeing them like this, just a cold, unwavering resolve. Slowly, he approached the bars, his piercing gaze locking onto theirs, watching as the reality of their situation finally dawned on them. The taller officer, the one who had been the most violent, shifted uneasily under Carter's glare. His face was ashen, his eyes darting nervously around the cell, desperate for an escape that didn't exist. "Chief," the taller officer stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "We didn't know. We didn't," he trailed off, his words failing under the weight of Carter's silent fury. Carter's lips tightened into a thin line as he stepped closer to the bars, cutting the officer off with a single look. "You didn't know?" he repeated, his voice low, filled with a barely restrained anger that sent a chill through the room. "You didn't know who I was when you dragged me out of that car? You didn't know when you snapped my arm? When you set my car on fire?" The officer looked down at the floor, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that would never come. His partner, the other officer, remained deathly silent, his wide, fearful eyes glued to the ground, too terrified to meet Carter's gaze. Carter leaned in closer, his towering presence casting a dark shadow over them. "You didn't care who I was," he hissed. "You saw a black man on a dark road and thought you could do whatever you wanted. You thought you could beat me, humiliate me, and leave me for dead, and that no one would ever know. You thought you could get away with it." His voice was calm, but each word landed with the force of a hammer. The taller officer swallowed hard, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the bench beneath him. "Chief, we made a mistake," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Carter's eyes narrowed even further, a cold rage flickering in his gaze. "A mistake," he said slowly, his voice dripping with disdain. "A mistake is something you can fix. What you did was intentional. It was deliberate. You knew exactly what you were doing." The silence that followed was suffocating. The weight of Carter's words hung in the air, thick and oppressive. The two officers squirmed in their seats, the full impact of their actions finally crashing down on them like a tidal wave. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Carter took a step back from the cell, his face unreadable. "You will pay for this," he said, his voice as cold as steel. "I'm going to make sure you never wear a badge again. You won't even be able to get a job cleaning toilets in this town. You're finished." The taller officer's face crumpled in fear, his earlier bravado completely shattered. "Please, Chief, he started, but the words caught in his throat, drowned by the terror that gripped him. Carter had heard enough. He turned to the other officers standing nearby, nodding toward the cell. "Take them to the briefing room," he ordered, his voice firm and commanding. "I want everyone to see what happens when you betray this department." The officers moved quickly, unlocking the cell and hauling the two disgraced men to their feet. The rogue officers didn't resist. They were too frightened, too broken to fight back as they were led out of the holding area and down the long corridor toward the briefing room. Carter followed closely behind, his body aching with every step, but his mind laser-focused on what needed to be done. In the briefing room, the entire department had gathered. The air was thick with tension as they waited in uneasy silence for what was to come. As Carter entered, all eyes turned to him, the weight of his presence palpable in the room. He walked to the front, standing tall despite the pain that racked his body. The two disgraced officers stood beside him, heads bowed in shame, their fear palpable. "This department stands for justice," Carter began, his voice strong and unwavering. "We serve to protect, not to abuse." These two men violated that trust. They attacked their chief because they thought they could get away with it. They believed no one would hold them accountable. His words cut through the room like a knife, and the silence was deafening. Every officer in the room stood at attention. Their respect for Carter mingled with a simmering sense of fear. He had survived, and now he was standing before them. A man who had taken the worst they could throw at him and still come out on top. There was no doubt left in anyone's mind. This was not just about enforcing the law. This was about showing what happens when justice is betrayed. Carter turned to face the two officers, his cold, penetrating gaze sweeping over them like a storm that would not be denied. "You are no longer police officers," he stated, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a blade. Each word he spoke was measured, deliberate, and infused with an authority that left no room for argument. "You will never wear a badge again, and I will personally ensure that no department across this country ever extends an offer to you. Your careers are over. No one will trust you again." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to fully sink in. The two officers, their once proud uniforms now symbols of disgrace, stood before him, their heads hung low. Carter's piercing stare held them in place, freezing them in the moment as their minds reeled from the reality of what had just been stripped from them. "But that's not all," he continued, his voice growing even more chilling. "You will also buy me a new car, the same model, the same make as the one you destroyed. And you will pay for it out of your pocket. No excuses." The taller officer, his face now drained of color, looked up at Carter, his voice shaky and weak. We can't afford that, sir. We don't have the money." Carter didn't give him a chance to finish. His interruption was swift, and his tone was unforgiving, like a hammer smashing against glass. "You'll find a way," he said, his words dripping with menace. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your lives paying for it in ways that will break you. And I promise, no matter where you go, I'll be there, making sure you never forget this night. You will pay, one way or another." The room fell into an unbearable silence. Carter took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the officers. The two men looked back at him, their faces pale with the realization that they were trapped, completely at his mercy. He was in control now, and there would be no escape from the judgment he had passed. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper. "I'm giving you a chance to make things right, but don't mistake this for mercy. It's not forgiveness. It's just the beginning of the rest of your miserable lives. You'll live every day knowing you crossed the wrong man." Carter's eyes flashed with the fire of determination. With a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his good hand, the one not battered by the earlier confrontation, and without a word, slapped the taller officer across the face. The sound of the slap was sharp and crisp, echoing through the room like the crack of thunder. The officer flinched, his face stinging from the force of the blow, his humiliation stark and evident in front of his colleagues. Without pausing, Carter turned to the second officer. He was already trembling, and before the man could gather his wits, Carter delivered the same punishment. The slap rang out again, and the officer's body jerked with the force of the blow. Both men stood there, utterly defeated, their pride shattered beyond repair. Their faces burned with the sting of shame, each man knowing they had just been publicly stripped of everything they once held dear. Carter's expression was cold, unmoving. He looked at them one last time, his eyes locking with theirs. "Get out of my sight," he said, his voice low and final. "You're done. You have no place here anymore." The two officers were escorted out of the room, their heads bowed, their bodies slumped in defeat. As they disappeared through the door, the silence that remained was thick and heavy. Carter didn't need to say anything more. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. The message was clear. Justice had been served, and retribution had come swiftly. Outside the station, the cool night air kissed Carter's bruised body as he stood beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. The night was quiet, the world around him still, almost serene. But inside, the fire that had fueled his resolve still burned hot and fierce. His muscles ached from the physical toll of the evening, but the pain in his body was nothing compared to the deeper, more insidious pain left by the betrayal. For years, Carter had worked to build this department, earned the trust and respect of his officers, and fought to lead with fairness and integrity. Now, in a single night, two men he had trusted had torn that trust apart, destroying everything he had worked for. The physical scars would fade, but the wound in his heart, the damage to the bond he had nurtured, would linger for far longer. As he stood there, his mind churning with the gravity of what had just happened, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. He knew. It was Lieutenant Andrews, calm and steady, as always. "Chief," Andrews said softly, his voice respectful but filled with concern. "The paperwork's been done. They've been officially removed from the force. They won't be coming back." Carter nodded, but his face remained a mask of unreadable emotion. He didn't speak for a moment, his thoughts swirling, weighed down by the events of the night. The anger, the sense of betrayal, and the immense responsibility of what he had just witnessed. It was all too much to process at that moment. Andrews stepped closer, his concern growing. "I know you did what you had to do," he said carefully, "but you're hurt. You need to rest. You should go to the hospital." Carter's expression hardened slightly as he turned to face the lieutenant. His voice was low, almost tired, but still carrying the weight of authority. "There will be time for that later," he said, his words gravelly from exhaustion. "Right now, I need to make sure this department knows that what happened tonight will never happen again. This kind of betrayal will not be tolerated." Andrews sighed, a look of worry crossing his features. "They know, Chief. Everyone saw what went down in that briefing room. They won't forget it. The message has been made clear." Carter looked down at his hands, the raw knuckles still red and swollen from the blows he had delivered. The sting of their faces still burned in his memory. The officer's humiliation had been a small but satisfying victory, yet it hadn't filled the emptiness inside him. There was still so much more that needed to be done, but for now, he knew one thing. Justice had been served, and the men who had betrayed him were gone. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 7 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. "The betrayal runs too deep," Carter said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion, barely concealing the weight of years of frustration. He took a slow, deliberate breath before continuing, his words heavy with meaning. "They weren't just rogue officers. No, they were a symptom of something far larger, something I've been trying to fight my entire career. A deep-rooted issue that has been festering for far too long." Andrews stood quietly beside him, his silence allowing Carter to speak freely. The air between them was thick with the weight of what had just transpired, with the profound implications of the situation weighing on both men. Carter's eyes were distant, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the station as if searching for answers in the dark. "I've spent years trying to build trust," he continued, his voice softening but gaining in intensity. "I've worked day and night, trying to prove that I deserve this position, that I could make a real difference. But to some people, none of that matters. To them, no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, I'll always be just." Andrews shifted his weight, his discomfort palpable. He was beginning to understand the depth of Carter's words, the hidden pain behind them. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice before speaking. "Sir, we all respect you. The department respects you. What those two did doesn't represent the rest of us. We know who you are, and we know what you stand for." Carter finally turned to face him, his eyes sharp, locking onto Andrews with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Maybe not," he replied, his tone unwavering. "But it doesn't change the fact that those two believed they could get away with it. And that, Andrews, is the problem." His voice carried the gravity of someone who had seen the system fail too many times. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken frustration. Carter knew the issue was not isolated to the actions of two officers. It ran much deeper. It was embedded in the very fabric of the system, in the way some officers viewed their authority, their responsibility, and the people they were sworn to serve. It was a sickness that had gone unchecked for too long. This wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. The wounds were too deep, the mistrust too pervasive. But Carter was resolute. "I need to make changes," he muttered, more to himself than to Andrews, his voice low and contemplative. "This department needs to be better. I need to be better." Andrews, ever loyal, frowned, his concern deepening. "Sir, you've already done more for this department than anyone else ever could. You've led with integrity, with strength. What happened tonight, what those two did, that wasn't your fault." Carter shook his head slowly, the bitterness of his words cutting through the cold night air. "Maybe not, but it's my responsibility to make sure it never happens again. I can't let this slide, not when so much is on the line." His voice was hard, the weight of leadership pressing down on him more than ever. He turned his gaze toward the empty streets, his thoughts clouded by the enormity of the challenge before him. This was no ordinary night. This was the moment where he would either stand firm or let the system continue to fail the people it was supposed to protect. The two officers were gone, their careers destroyed by their actions, but the scar they left behind would not heal easily. Carter had witnessed firsthand how easily the line between law enforcement and abuse of power could blur, and he was determined to make sure that line was never crossed again under his watch. "Starting tomorrow," Carter said, his voice firm and resolute, "we're implementing new training for every officer in this department. Cultural sensitivity, use of force protocols, everything. Anyone who refuses to take it seriously, who resists this change, will be out. No exceptions." Andrews nodded, though he wasn't entirely surprised by the decision. "I'll get the details organized first thing in the morning," he said, his tone steady. Carter gave a short nod, his gaze momentarily softening. His plan was set in motion, but there was something else, something more personal that needed to be addressed. "I want them to pay for my car," Carter said, his voice cold and detached. "Every last cent." Andrews raised an eyebrow but didn't question the order. "I'll make sure that happens," he said, acknowledging the request with a serious nod. Carter's jaw tightened, the finality in his tone unmistakable. And after that, he continued, his voice hardening with resolve. "They're done. They won't work in law enforcement again. I'll make sure of it." There would be no second chances, no redemption. The actions of the two officers had proven that they could not be trusted, and their careers would be their punishment. The two men stood in silence, their thoughts heavy with the weight of what had happened and what was to come. Carter's mind raced, strategizing the steps that lay ahead. This was just the beginning of a long, grueling battle, one that would require every ounce of strength he had. Finally, Andrews spoke, his voice softer this time, filled with empathy. "Chief, you've been through hell tonight. You need to rest." Carter sighed, the exhaustion finally catching up to him. His body ached, his muscles sore from the emotional and physical toll of the evening. He had pushed himself far beyond his limits, but still, his mind refused to rest. There was too much at stake, too much to do. "I'll rest when this is done," Carter said, though he knew deep down that the road ahead was far from over. The challenges, the obstacles, the injustices, these things wouldn't be solved in a single night. They were systemic, entrenched in the very system he had devoted his life to. But he wasn't about to back down now, not when so much was on the line. Andrews gave him a small, understanding nod. "Take care of yourself, Chief. We need you." With that, Andrews turned and walked away, leaving Carter standing alone in the quiet of the night. Carter remained where he was for a long moment, staring into the darkness, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The officers responsible had paid a price, but the deeper issues were still very much alive. The fight against systemic racism and abuse of power was not something that could be conquered in a single moment. It would take time, effort, and unwavering determination. But Carter was ready for that fight. He was more resolved than ever. He was going to be the one to lead the charge, to push for the long overdue change. As he finally turned to head back inside the station, his body aching with every step, Carter knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over. But he wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. Michael Carter stood there, battered but unbroken. Justice had been served, and the officers responsible for the night's brutality were gone. Fired. Disgraced. Their badges were stripped away. Yet Carter knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. His mission was now crystal clear: to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, to reform the department from within, and to ensure that no one else would ever have to suffer the same fate as he had. He stared into the night, a resolve burning in his chest. This was only the beginning. As we reflect on Michael Carter's harrowing journey, it's clear that his experience sheds light on critical issues of respect, justice, and resilience. Each of us can learn something from his struggle against prejudice and the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. What have you learned from this story? We invite you to share one key takeaway and how you plan to incorporate it into your life in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave your comment and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful stories like this one.